700 miles of unspoiled beaches and towns line the coast of the Pacific Northwest. These coastal communities are known for their fishing and logging industries. They also draw thousands of tourists all summer long, like the town of West Fort Washington, 130 miles southwest of Seattle.
It's not unreasonable to have up to 15, maybe even 20,000 people in town on a busy week.
And they could all be washed away in this terrible double disaster, a deadly tsunami caused by a colossal earthquake. Because 100 miles out to sea is one of the most formidable fault lines on the planet, known as the Cascadia subduction zone.
These subduction zone earthquakes make the largest earthquakes in the world.
And if a magnitude 9 quake rips along this mighty fault, it would not only pulverize buildings, roads, and bridges, it would also trigger massive tsunami waves that hammer the coast.
There's a very high likelihood that in a Cascadia, at least a severe Cascadia event, that we're going to become an island really quickly.
Hundreds of communities would be completely cut off by the sudden rush of water.
The ocean would suddenly join into the Whitewater River.
This shocking scenario may sound far-fetched, but it has happened before, 2,000 miles to the north. Alaska residents deeply appreciate their natural environment. Little do they know, their treasured homeland is in grave danger. That's because for hundreds of years, pressure has been building along the border of two massive chunks of the Earth's crust, called tectonic plates.
Over geologic time, we have the Pacific plate moving against the North American plate in this rate of about 5.5 centimeters a year.
As the Pacific plate presses northward, it's been sliding underneath the North American plate. It's called a subduction zone because one plate subducts or slides underneath another. But along the way, the craggy surfaces tend to stick together. The result is that the top plate gets forced upwards. The pressure continues to build.
So at some critical point, the Earth's crust gives way, and then it'll slip outward, and then that process of slipping outward is what generates an earthquake.
This type of earthquake is what hit Kodiak, Alaska in 1964. Kodiak is a typical small Alaskan town. For Donald Darnell, it's a teenage boy's paradise.
Just a short walk from town, you were out in the wilderness, you know, where there were plenty of bears and deer and small critters and stuff.
Friday, March 27th, was no different from any other day. Fishing rigs slowly chug into the harbor. Locals head home from another day at work. Suddenly, the tranquility is blasted to bits. A tremendous shockwave tears through the ocean floor, sending a jolting 9.2 earthquake into Kodiak.
It immediately got worse and louder. And so my father said, "Everybody out of the house."
Donald escapes his shaking house and out into a worse nightmare.
We could see all these people flooding out of their homes, falling on the ground, screaming, crossing themselves, crying in total panic.
The earth continues to shudder and shake.
The most stable physical thing in my life was shaking so violently that I could hardly stand up. There was nothing to hold on to.
The Earth's crust is ripping at a speed of about 3 kilometers a second.
The two tectonic plates are finally becoming unstuck, and this ripping motion creates a terrifying sound.
It was so incredibly loud, it was like 10 freight trains being under your feet. We had to scream to hear each other. To this day, I don't know how many minutes it went on, but it just went on and on and on.
But an even worse horror has just begun. 14 miles under the sea floor.
As the Earth's crust moved there, it displaced the water on this large scale.
Hundreds of cubic kilometers of displaced water are being transformed into gigantic waves, a killer tsunami.
eventually it caused a train of waves to come into the Kodiak area.
The quake has generated sea waves up to 30 to 35 feet.
Donald learns from a radio broadcast that this train of waves, a series of 30-foot tsunami waves, is screaming toward his hometown. To survive, residents have got to find some higher ground, out of reach of the raging waters.
So the whole town started to evacuate up the road to Pillar Mountain.
As the tsunami comes crashing ashore, the waves tear through the town, lifting buildings from their foundations and tossing them aside like toys.
The momentum behind these buildings just did massive destruction.
Unrelenting waves continue to pound the coastline into the middle of the night.
An awful part of a tsunami is that the water keeps coming and coming.
We could hear all the boats smashing through town over and over and over. The sound of the waves washing all the buildings and debris up to higher ground.
Donald hears these haunting sounds as he and his family huddle in fear on Pillar Mountain.
It was no longer thrilling and exciting. It was devastating.
Finally, the waves stop by dawn, and sunrise sheds light across the town.
It really hit me that my world was changed forever. The town I loved was completely gone, and I just sat down and cried.
But Kodiak was not the only town that was destroyed. 250 miles northeast, parts of Anchorage lay in ruins. 300 miles northeast, the port of Valdez was reduced to rubble. 115 people died in Alaska, a small number considering the widespread damage. That's because the area was mostly sparsely populated. But today, in the Pacific Northwest, hundreds of thousands of people could be affected at any moment by a similar disaster.
The geologic setting of southern Alaska is basically identical to that off of coastal Oregon and Washington. And so an earthquake like the 1964 earthquake can occur in the future in the Cascadia subduction zone.
In fact, the very same geological structure that has caused the world's biggest earthquakes and tsunamis ever on record. Most recently, in the Indian Ocean.
In the 21st century so far, we've had one, Sumatra in 2004. So that's the basis for estimating the effects of a magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake.
Effects that would impact an area more densely populated than Alaska. First of all, the Pacific Northwest contains a major metropolis.
On a typical day in Seattle, you will see 500,000 people in the city.
And the region is also home to many towns and cities, packed with hundreds of thousands of people on a typical summer weekend.
You're going to end up with people being injured from falling buildings, bridges collapsing, falling glass.
It's going to happen. The question is, when is going to happen?
Quakes on the Cascadia Fault have been launching tsunami waves into this coastline for centuries. And scientists know that these earthquakes, followed directly by tsunamis, rattle the region every few hundred years.
And indeed, there's geologic evidence that it's happened in the past.
By studying layers of sediment in the marshes and tidal flats around the Northwest, geologist Brian Atwater has determined that the last killer combo tore into the northwestern coast about 300 years ago.
An earthquake raised this tide flat here, converting it into a freshwater swamp.
The most obvious signs of past tsunamis are layers of sand left behind by the waves. As tsunami waves rushed on shore, they picked up sand, carried it across the land, and deposited sand sheets along the way.
You can see sand, mud, sand, mud, sand, mud from the train of waves, showing you that the tsunami consisted not just of a single wave, but of a whole series.
The cause of these gargantuan quakes? Plate tectonics. Here in the Pacific Northwest, The North American plate is not rubbing against the Pacific plate, but a smaller plate called the Juan de Fuca. But when this fault ruptures, the consequences are still devastating. The first is an earthquake.
The earthquake is shaking that results from the rocks slipping past one another.
The second effect is a tsunami.
We'll have ocean bottom displaced vertically, meaning that part of the ocean bottom will go up and part will subside, will go down. It's billions of tons of water displaced.
This creates a large hump in the surface of the ocean, about 30 feet high.
It will then spread as a wave, and this wave is the tsunami wave. So a tsunami wave, as we saw from Sumatra, may be the main cause of the destruction as a result of the earthquake.
300 years have passed without a major quake in the Cascadia subduction zone. Scientists believe that another one is due soon.
This place has a history of earthquakes the size of the Indian Ocean disaster, so it's something to be concerned about.
We will definitely see an earthquake on the subduction zone and a tsunami. We just don't know the size, and we don't know when it will occur.
And when it happens, there will be no warning at all. Hundreds of thousands of vacationers are beachcombing, fishing, and shopping in Westport and other towns down the coast. And in Seattle, over 500,000 people are enjoying a sunny summer day. Suddenly, 100 miles off the coast, the juncture of the two tectonic plates rips apart.
The break starts someplace, and then the breakage front moves at something like 2 miles per second.
The ground jolts one way, then the next, with raging force.
The ground will shake violently back and forth, and so almost the sensation of your feet yanking out from underneath you.
The effects are immediate and deadly.
It kills people right away.
In Seattle's historic Pioneer Square, brick buildings packed with tourists begin to crumble.
The fronts of buildings could be collapsing, elevated highways falling.
Some of Seattle's famous coffee shops, markets, and pubs are shaken into piles of rubble.
We'll have very long rupture going on for probably up to 10 minutes.
Meanwhile at sea, a beast is born in the form of a burgeoning tsunami wave. People in Westport and other coastal towns are directly in the tsunami's path. Within 20 minutes of the quake, people in those towns begin to notice the ocean water drawing back.
You probably will see the water receding from the coastline.
A telltale sign of the trough of the tsunami headed for the coast first. Sirens blare their warnings. People race away from the coast in a panic. They must get to high ground to survive. But the roads leading out of the cities will be impassable, destroyed by the earthquake.
Very few people would be able to evacuate the Westport area.
And the tsunami continues its relentless advance.
There will be the turbulent, violent wave front approaching the coastline.
The first wave rears its frothy head and slams into the coast beach.
You would get a very large wave rolling in and crashing in.
It rushes on shore with the sound of a freight train.
Waves are going to be coming in from the ocean this way and washing up against it or going over the top of this area.
Water streams over the beach and across the dunes in Westport, but it also enters the harbor, funneling into bars and eateries along West Haven Drive.
In the area you're at, actually here, it's going to be coming from different directions. 20 feet or more of water in this area surging through.
Worst of all will be the tangle of debris torn up by the waves.
All the cars will be floating along with the wave.
Tons of crushed steel wash through the town, smashing buildings and people.
Where a lot of the deaths and injuries occur is because you're a target with the water itself, all of the debris.
Nearby logging operations will add to the turmoil.
It's easy to imagine tsunami coming in, finding those logs and putting them afloat, and then using them as battering rams on houses and on people.
This tsunami wave itself will not reach Seattle. But if the earthquake triggers landslides under Puget Sound, portions of the city could also be suddenly inundated. Stunned residents and tourists will be surrounded by a crumbled mess of buildings, cars, and bodies.
There aren't enough resources to help communities after a disaster, so it becomes very important for people to take action themselves.
Thousands of people left to fend for themselves in a wasteland of rubble and mud.
For a subduction zone event, a recovery of transportation systems could be a matter of weeks or months.
Coming up, is there any way to save thousands of stranded people as 50-foot waves pound the shore?
Cascadia tsunami will be so much stronger. It will create so much more damage that you have to understand that if you don't do anything about it, there will be a major disaster.
A giant earthquake and thundering tsunami will one day sweep across the Pacific Northwest.
For most of the towns, a big portion of the coastal part of the town will be in the inundation zone, meaning that most of it will be destroyed.
The biggest problem facing residents is that no one can predict when the earthquakes that trigger tsunamis will occur.
We know they're coming, we just don't know when. Unlike other disasters, we don't get a warning.
But the experts are using every technique available to mitigate the disaster when it comes. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has stationed tsunami buoys across the ocean, which detect tsunamis by monitoring the rise and fall of the sea surface. Scientists like Vasily Titov have built complex computer models that predict how tsunami waves will behave as they wash over the coast.
After the tsunami is generated, we can predict how far it would go, how fast it will go, how high it's going to be. Pretty good.
This information is a key to planning evacuation routes. It's passed on to towns and cities so their residents can be prepared.
There's not enough time for them to figure out what they're going to do then. They need to have already known and just respond.
But in small coastal towns like Westport, Washington, city officials face two more major obstacles. First, they expect the 2 roads and 1 bridge out of town to be destroyed.
So to escape this wave, you have to go very far inland or very high to escape this violent flood.
Unfortunately, the town only has 1 tiny sliver of high ground.
This is the high dune that runs along the center, runs from the lighthouse behind me down to the south, several hundred yards.
A few hundred yards for 20,000 people. And it's possible that even this high ground will be swamped if the waves are over 40 feet high.
It's almost undoubtedly that at least some amount of water would completely overtop all of the land that's within Westport.
And when it does, residents can only pray that they escape in time. Up next, what can you do to prepare yourself before you end up in a wave-scoured wasteland? A tsunami will one day tear apart this seemingly peaceful slice of America. But what are the chances that it will really happen within our lifetimes?
The odds of another great Cascadia earthquake in the next 50 years is something like 1 in 10.
You think about it a little bit. Of course, it's going to scare you a little bit, and it could possibly happen. I mean, it's a chance.
If there was an earthquake off the coast of Washington, Westport would pretty much be underwater.
Having a planned evacuation route to high ground is essential, but it's equally important to have the right supplies.
You should have food, again, for a minimum of 3 days. Batteries, battery-powered AM/FM radio, flashlights, blankets, first aid kit. You know, the kind of things you would probably take camping with you.
Awareness can improve your chances if you start preparing now.
The good news is that it could be hundreds of years away.
The bad news, of course, is that it could happen tomorrow.